guys, and welcome back to the Wrestling Stoop with the legend himself, Bob Roop. I am your co-host, Ray Russell, and it's good to be back. After an unplanned week off, glad to know that Bob Roop doing all right, and he's here to talk to us, bring us back to Georgia Championship Wrestling circa the early 1980s. We're going to bring him back onto the show right now. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. Couldn't do it without him, Mr. Bob Roop.
Well, thank you, Ray. It's good to be back, and I'm not sure exactly what my voice sounds like, but the person behind it is fine, so I'm doing good. Oh, man, being sick, I'm telling you, I've been very lucky in my life. I have very few illnesses. I've never had a lung problem. All I had was just an infection, but I couldn't breathe. I mean, at least not as much as I wanted to, let's put it that way. Even though I've got a couple of days I had a 10-day medication. I'm on my last 2 days, but I feel much better. I'm not coughing. My lungs are clear.
Well, that's good.
So you talk about life is good. I'm telling you, anybody out there, if you've got good health, even if you've got bills to pay and all kinds of problems, if you've got good health, you've got something good going for you. And my advice to you is to try to do your best to try to stay in good health. Because when you lose it, I'm telling you, when you can't breathe, how much money you got in the bank doesn't matter a dang bit, because it wouldn't matter if you got 50 million or 10 cents. You can't breathe, and none of that matters.
Right. Yeah, that's for sure.
So take care of yourself out there,
well,
my friend.
You know, Bob, you had a lot of people, I guess a few people worried, but a lot of people just supporting you, backing you, giving out thoughts and prayers. I announced last week that there would be no Wrestling Stoop because you were under the weather, and I left it at that. I didn't want to give out all your personal information, but they poured in, Bob. Oh, that's my favorite podcast, one of my top 3. It's always in my streaming list. They missed you. They really, really missed you, Bob. And everybody, just a lot of well wishes came out for you. And I guess the power of prayer, or whatever you want to call it, it worked. And of course, the medication didn't hurt as well.
On that note, my good dear friend, I love her, and her husband, Joyce Postian, and her husband, Woody. Joyce texted me that she had heard through the podcast that I was under the weather, and she sent me her regards. So that connects with what you just said. She was one of the people who heard your message. So I appreciate you getting that out there. And listen, all those good wishes, I tell you, I believe in that. And I believe they had an effect. I believe that they helped me recover. So I want to say thank you to everybody out there, because again, it doesn't matter whether it helps or not. If I believe it helps, then it does help.
Right.
So thank you very, very much.
Yeah,
I love you all dearly for doing that.
This would have been our week off, but since we missed last week, I wanted to get another one in. I don't want to rip anyone off. And since you were doing better, and you sounded great when we got on the phone here today, you were like, I feel great. Well, there was actually an expletive in there too I left out, but it was good to hear you in such a positive mood and positive vibes coming out of an illness like that, having the lung issues and whatnot. So it's great. I'm glad we're back, and we're ready to roll back into Georgia one more time.
I was going to say Roll Tide, but that's the wrong state.
Wrong state.
So,
Close.
Go you dogs. Well, the Georgia football team is my favorite team.
Okay.
I really like their coach and the way their philosophy and the way they play and everything, and they're fun to watch. That's one of the reasons. I don't like a football game that ends up 3-3 or 3-0 or whatever, because
sure.
they're boring. But those games that are like 53 or 52 to 42, I like that. There's a lot of action, a lot of things to watch, and back and forth. And anyway, and Georgia, I lived in Atlanta for 3 years, and sure. I always enjoyed. I like the state of Georgia very much.
Brother. All right. The Peach State of Georgia. I am a Buckeye myself, of course, OHIO, but being from the state, I guess I'm a little biased there, but that's okay. Georgia games are fun to watch. Like you said, there's scoring to be had, and that's always a good time. But it's even better if you bet on them and they win. Yeah, you can go far with that. But don't bet out there. There's a gambling number across the bottom of the screen. Every time they tell you, don't do that. Don't gamble.
Oh yeah, that's my own philosophy. I'm not a gambler. I remember coming back from Japan one time. The plane from Los Angeles back to the East Coast got shunted to Las Vegas, and we had to spend the night there. I was in this casino, I went down. I just was bored. I went down into, the hotel we were staying at had a casino, and the hotel that the airlines put us in had a casino, and I went down to the casino. I had about $5,000-6,000 that I just all $100 bills I had just been paid in Japan. I went down there, and for some stupid reason, I played blackjack. In about 15 minutes, I lost $700. Oh, I was so sick of. And I was only betting like $10, $20 at a time.
Sure,
but I don't know how to play blackjack very well.
No, that'll get you real quick, Bob, if you don't know what you're doing on that table, because they can get you even when you do know what you're doing.
Well, the fact that I still remember that, because most of my money is hard won. I have to earn it. It's not given to me. So,
sure.
Just to boast, it was like not a week, but most of a week's pay in Japan, I blew in like half hour. You talk about feeling like a mark. Oh, man.
And let's be clear, that's $700 in yesterday's money. That's a lot more today. Yeah, that's not cool, Bob. What are you doing? Anyways.
Yeah, I should have just, I could have just taken it out in my room,
given it to me,
and flushed it down the toilet.
I would have gladly taken a tip if you'd wanted to pass the buck there.
Yeah. So anyway.
Man. Well, good stuff. Good fun story there. So Bob's not much of a gambler. People would say I am. I have 40 kids, so you'll have that. And so, if anybody gets that joke, we're going to go back to Georgia one more time, back to the mid-'80s now, as Vince McMahon begins to make his play. On the last episode, we closed up talking about Vince coming in to Cincinnati, the very first town that he took from Ole Anderson in Georgia Championship Wrestling. Vince comes in, takes their TV station, takes their venue. And the fallout, we go back to Ole's book here, Bob. He says, I was on the phone that same afternoon after Vince took his town, talking to Vern Gagne of the AWA. We were having one of our phone meetings where we were trying to decide how were we going to fight Vince McMahon. Spoiler alert, guys, you really couldn't. But as Ole was telling Vern about the tactics that Vince used, Vern was laughing and poo-pooing it. He couldn't believe it was even possible. They can't do that, said Vern. But 2 hours later, Vern got a call from a person he had handling the San Francisco area, and the guy said, Vern, we just lost our TV station. Vince's people had stuck it to Vern too. They took the Cow Palace right from under him, and then they took his TV. Or maybe it was vice versa, but Vern called me back and said, we just lost our TV in San Francisco. So it didn't start with TBS. Vince began taking the cities little by little here, especially in the well, look at it. Cincinnati was a town that Georgia ran, but not as often as Columbus or Cleveland. And Vern, again, in the AWA, they weren't running the Cow Palace every week. And that had been a Shire territory, as you know, back in the day. And so it was easy pickings. It seems like Vince was coming into the old territories and taking city by city the places he felt were maybe easy to take to begin with.
Curious if that was around the time that Shire went to the I believe it was the Los Angeles Times, and did a 2 or 3, I'm talking about whole pages.
Yeah, the expose on pro wrestling, exposing the business.
Yes.
Right.
My sister.
That had been before this, for sure.
Okay. Yeah, Roy Shire, he was, if I can't have it, nobody's going to have it.
Right.
He what a venal, he was a very venal person. Thank God I hadn't say look down, but we can look back and say, I was very, very fortunate neither one of us are that way, because I think we'd be as miserable as he was. So, but the thing that strikes me is that one thing that just about all the promoters had a deal where they weren't paying for the TV, they were bartering. They were bartering their commercial time. I don't know about Vern, but he had been promoting in the, I want to see ESPN that went into the Caribbean. When I heard about that, I was in Florida getting ready to try to promote the Caribbean. And so I looked into it, and it turned out, I'm not 100% correct, but I believe that he was paying $4,000 a week to the people who were to ESPN, because that's what they wanted to charge me to run our show in there. The thing is, with Ole and Vern and Shire or anybody, the thing they had against them was that they weren't used to, or they weren't accustomed to it. I don't think they wanted to ever have to buy TV time. They wanted to do the barter, which, if you think about it, if you're running a show once a month and you have to pay, say, $1,000 a week to have your TV on that in that town, you're $4,000 in the hole before you ever even have a show. So I can see why it would be, it would be, now if you had like 10 towns like that, you're talking about 40 grand a week out the pocket before you even run a show. So I can see why they would not want to do it that way. A junior could just come in and buy, he just would come in and pay for it.
Well, it became paid programming versus the local television stations having to find commercials, advertisers.
Yes.
Vince basically comes in and says, I'm going to pay you for this hour and let it be my problem to find the advertisers.
Oh, he had his own stuff. At one time, I think it's a pay-per-view, the one in Detroit at the
Silverdome.
Silverdome.
Sure.
I think one of the items they had was some kind of jacket or something. It would cost $500, and people were buying them.
It just came out recently that they made over $100,000 just in selling their programs, the magazines at that event. So yeah, I'd say that was just a hell of a coup for Vince in general. Just everything they were making, the profits off of that show is just insane.
Leave aside anything that had come out lately about personal values and behavior. But as a businessman, Vince was very, very, I don't know if it's lucky, but he was very bright. Because if you have your own products to advertise, to sell, you're in business because you've got 12 minutes at every hour of your TV. You've got 12 minutes to promote, to advertise and sell those products.
Yeah.
So, Ole didn't have that. We didn't have, I don't know how many millions of dollars of figurines, those little dolls. I know I was talking about Iron Sheik. Getting checks for 2 checks, both of them right around $100,000. Those are basically for dolls, selling dolls. So imagine how many dolls, if you sold a doll for, say, $5, $10, I don't know what they cost, but say you sold it for $10, the wrestler probably only got 10% or whatever. How many of those would you have to sell to make up $100,000?
No kidding. I've heard stories of some of the guys lower on the totem pole, much lower than the Iron Sheik on the roster, and they even had a figure made of them, and they weren't really making a whole lot of money on the road, but just selling those action figures, if you will. A lot of people, the men out there want to call them action figures, but they called them dolls back then, the wrestling dolls. And for the amount they were making just off of selling the figures, they were able to compensate the lack of maybe money. I'm not saying Vince didn't pay the guys. These guys were getting paid. That's why they jumped to that territory. But maybe some of the guys that weren't higher up on the roster weren't getting, as much, obviously. And so I even heard some of the wrestlers say, and again, this is, looking back decades ago, but they said, I was getting ready to quit the territory 350 days a year. I just couldn't do it. It was driving me. Not that you didn't do that in any territory, but Vince was going from coast to coast. And some of these guys were going a little crazy. And they said, but then those royalties would come in, man. And you knew you couldn't quit. I mean, this is where the money was in the royalties. Because like you said, everybody else was in the wrestling business. Vince was in the marketing business. I mean, he saw, it's not just, all right, we're going to have an angle and we're going to sell out the arena and we're going to have a good wrestling match. Vince said, no, we're going to have figures and posters and magazines and every kind of toy you could possibly imagine. Imagine how much money they were making that had nothing to do with the on-screen product.
I read some books. Mick Foley wrote several books, and they're great, by the way. Mick Foley is one of the most successful wrestlers. I don't care about Dory Funk Jr., Harley Race, Jack Brisco, Hulk Hogan. I don't care who you're talking about. This guy's one of the most successful wrestlers that's ever been because he's a multi-millionaire, and he's got a great reputation. And I read his books, and who was the announcer? Jim Ross. Jim Ross. I also read his book. I did it actually to prepare for our endeavor together here. I wanted to get as much information as I could. Mm-hmm. But by reading those books, I found out kind of what was going on. Ross was sitting in an office right down the hall from Vince Jr. Sure. So, you're right there. And I figured it was a good way to look and get an inside look. But, those guys, Nick had the advantage of, first of all, he had very good books. They're excellent. I advise anybody out there who's a wrestling fan, maybe the library has them. Who knows if you don't feel like buying a book, but they're a great read. They're very, very enjoyable. He's a very talented, very, very warm and caring person. One of the finest guys. I don't know him very well. I wish I did, but I admire the heck out of him much more than I admire. And don't get me wrong. I don't look down on anybody. I just don't think about. But some people I don't think about. I guess that's my way of. I don't want to look down on anybody. So if I can't think of something positive about anybody, I just don't think about them. But yeah, Nick wrote about some of the money that was coming in, and him having the advantage of being able to promote his books to the WWE. What a blessing!
Yeah, what a machine! God. What a market! Yeah, that's.
Yeah! Oh yeah!
Well, Vince was doing it back here. It was just getting started. He was selling T-shirts and things of that nature, but he was also taking over the country, basically city by city. And then comes the 1983 NWA promoters meeting. And Vince Sr. at that time was still, the WWF, still a member of the NWA, at least until August of 1983. That's when the story goes, and it's on the Dark Side of the Ring, and I believe it's in Ole's book as well somewhere, that was when Vince Sr., Jr., someone stood up and said they would no longer be affiliated with the National Wrestling Alliance at that point. So they were stepping away, which should have brought some idea of what was the things to come, I should say. And so Ole says in his book here, he says, I had voiced my feelings on the situation of Vince taking over these cities at the NWA promoters meeting in 1983. Vince Jr.'s father, Vince Sr., Vincent James McMahon, was a member of the NWA, so he was there. I stood up in the middle of the meeting and I said, what a bunch of bullshit this meeting is. Here's Vince McMahon, a member of the NWA. And while he's sitting here in this meeting with us, his bastard son is out there stealing our TV stations. I don't know how well that went on. Now, old man McMahon approached me later that day and he said, you and my boy are very much alike. I was stunned. I remember thinking, does he mean I'm a piece of shit like his son? Wow, Ole, what a book. He said he wanted me to meet upstairs with Vinny, that's Vincent Kennedy, guys, to discuss things, but I wouldn't do it. I didn't want any part of it. I said, you guys have been out there stealing our TV, stealing our buildings. I don't have anything to talk to him about. At the end of several days of meetings, Vince Sr. stood up and announced that the WWF was withdrawing from the NWA. And now, according to the Dark Side of the Ring, Jim Barnett makes the same call that he is no longer affiliated with the NWA at this meeting. And I never saw that in any writing before. And it comes out, it looks like Barnett was able to finagle selling all of his Georgia stock at some point. Now, nobody can prove it, but to Jim Oates, his business partner, if you will. And so they claim, at least the way they show it on the Dark Side, that Vince and Jim Barnett leave basically side by side. I don't know if that was for entertainment purposes on your television screen or what the deal was, but you have to think, talk about screwing Jim Barnett over in a way. Now, Ole felt like he was screwing them over, the other promoters involved in the Georgia territory, but Ole essentially taking all the money away from Barnett, taking all the power away from Barnett, who had been in the business since the beginning of time, since basically the inception of television. And Barnett was not a guy to be fucked with from everything I could gather.
Think about it, again, knowing both of them, Barnett and Ole. Mm-hmm. Think about after what Ole did to Barnett, it wasn't just taking the money from him. It was also taking his position. When he was running the company, I mean, he was one of the major players in the country because of TBS, because their product went worldwide. So he got that taken away from him. What do you think, Barnett, the last thing he thought about before he went to bed at night, and the first thing he thought about when he woke up in the morning? He thought about bending Ole over and use your imagination.
Well, probably the wrong person to get to that with, but yeah, I totally agree with you. I could imagine that Ole Anderson was on his mind and revenge was very close second. Yes. And so clearly he started plotting and planning at some point with the McMahons, or at least one of the McMahons.
I likened him in a former program. I likened him to a black widow spider, which is small and innocuous, but when it bites you, you don't usually don't even see it until it bites you. And sometimes even then you don't.
And it can be too late, right? That's an excellent analogy.
But I knew Barnett. I don't want to say well, but I did, because when we would fly in Australia, sometimes he would ask me to come up and sit by him.
Sure.
Because we would talk about intellectual stuff, about books and different things. And he enjoyed having some. I mean, don't get me wrong, I sound like a snob here, but
No, I would say the average professional wrestler didn't really get into it. I'm not saying everybody, but a lot of the guys were just there to do their job and go about, daily life as well. You hear a lot of the guys just like to drink and have a good time, and there's nothing wrong with that. But I could see someone like a Jim Barnett trying to pick someone out of the pile that he could have a conversation with beyond, just wrestling talk.
He was a promoter in Australia. Everybody talked about Australia in the territories. The guys that went to Australia had got a tour would always come back, and of course, now they're world travelers. They, maybe Australia would be their first trip out of the country, or maybe Japan, but they would come back and they talk about it because it was a way to kind of put themselves over a little bit, and they would always praise Barnett as being a good businessman, and even if they didn't, the fact that he was the one calling the shots. He was the one that would bring you over. He's the one that made the decision. He was the authority figure in my mind.
Right.
So I gave him all the credit and respect that came with that. But I admired it because he was obviously a great businessman. Here's this guy. The first time I ever actually saw him in person was in a dressing room, and there's all these guys, Mark Lewin, King Curtis, Big Bad John, who's about twice Barnett's size. All these guys are sitting around or standing around listening to this little diminutive, queen-like man give them instructions and tell them what they were going to be doing. And he's looking like $1 million. He's probably got $1,000 suit on and immaculately coiffed and all that. And I admired him. I didn't care about it. In fact, if I'd have thought about it, I thought, that he is able to do this in spite of what he is personally. Sure. It's even more admirable when you think about it. Mm-hmm. So, especially in our business, we're all supposed to be so rough and tumble and all.
Manly men, absolutely.
Yeah, the man's man, the boy, be a pro wrestler. Yeah. So, I always admired him, but I admired what he had done. Him personally, I didn't think about it. First of all, you never got to know Barnett well enough to make a personal judgment. You only had his behavior. He never told you his values. What he thought or, what his values were. He just, I'm telling you, he was a very, very bad enemy to have because he was powerful, he was connected, he had ends and politically, he contributed. I'm convinced to this day that he spent a lot of the money he spent making political contributions and buying his way into having some say-so. So
after you pointed that out an episode or two ago, that makes a lot of sense. Did he keep all the money for himself? Well, he probably spent a little on those chauffeurs and those chefs and things of that nature, but that's a lot of money to be taken out just for a chauffeur or a chef. So I absolutely 100%, I could see him, like you said, basically buying himself friends, if you will, in high places, low friends in high places, basically. Yeah. Is what the political scene is like. And so I gotta tell you, man, that's great that we're able to get some insight into the Barnett guy, and that Black Widow spider thing. That you hit the nail on the head with that, because you're right. By the time he bites you, it's too late most of the time, and it's going to be too late for Ole here in just a little bit as we continue with the story. But there's some other things that go on, and you kind of touched on this at the end of last episode as well. You talked about a time when Jake Roberts was hit up basically by maybe a tip from someone, and he was searched by the police or whomever it was. And there's some stories here in Ole's book about similar things involving Jake and Buzz Sawyer. And I wanted to read those real quick to you and just get your opinion on them.
Okay. Sounds good.
All right. So Ole says here in the book, other things began to happen almost immediately. I don't have proof that Vince had anything to do with it, but 8 to 10 squad cars pulled up at the TBS TV station in Atlanta one Saturday morning to pick up Jake the Snake Roberts. They had been tipped off that he had drugs with him. He was on enough crap that it wouldn't have surprised me if they did find something, but I asked them, where did you get this information? And of course, they wouldn't tell me. All they said was, we had a reliable source who told us he was dealing in drugs. And they took Jake to jail, searched all his bags, and didn't find anything but prescription drugs to Jake. They were legal prescriptions, but they still took him down to the station. And I told the police, your reliable information wasn't very reliable, now was it? I had to send somebody down to get Jake out so he could make it to TV, but by the time they got back to the studio, it was too late. So that was a story on Jake, and I know you have a different one as well. They also arrested Buzz Sawyer at the airport one time, turned all of his bags inside out, and threw them all over the place. That happened several times with some of the talent here in Georgia. The police would be waiting for us when we got off the plane, searching bags, making guys take their clothes off. We had our cars trashed, windows smashed, and tires flattened. Wow, okay. He says things like that began to happen on a frequent basis. We had shows canceled. We would call the building manager, hey, how are the ticket sales going? We stopped selling them, would say the ticket taker. What do you mean you stopped selling them, asked Ole. We got a call from your office last week. They said you were canceling the show. Interesting.
Okay.
At other times, someone would call the building manager and say, our TV didn't air this past Saturday, or the guys got into a car wreck. We're going to have to cancel the show. When we would get to the building, the morons would tell us, you called us yesterday to cancel the show. We gave everybody their money back. Things like that happened over and over. There were all kinds of weird things going on. Was Vince behind any of it? I don't have any proof to say he was. Do I think he was? Sure. Nothing like that ever happened until he got involved, but I don't have any proof and probably never will.
Barnett would be perfect for that, to be doing that kind of...
well, he would know who the druggies are, for certain.
Yes. And he would, Barnett loved gossip. That's one of the reasons that he and I got along so well, especially when I had my girlfriend with me, because he could gossip with her, and then he couldn't gossip with me in the same way, more of the feminine type of values and things. Oh, he would be perfect for that because, again, doing it sneaky, doing it from behind, doing it out of the bushes where you couldn't tell who the saboteur was. He'd be perfect for that. And what a way to endear himself and prove to McMahon that he was someone that would be useful to have in your organization, is to be a spoiler. If you can't make things happen, can you make things unhappen? Can you tear things down?
Right.
That's a very valuable asset. Attila the Hun wasn't known for building up major cities. He was known for tearing them down and piling skulls like 20 feet high in a big pile. He didn't want to tear down every city, but he would tear down one or two and let the people know, listen, if you don't just give up and give us all your money and give us your women and your children, whatever we want, this is what's going to happen to you. And he usually only had to tear down one or two cities before everybody would go, okay, yeah, come on, take what you want. Just don't destroy us and tear down the whole place. That's a way of doing business that is very effective. And totally negative. You're murdering people and doing horrible things, but it works. And that was Barnett's forte too. He could be like with a spider. What more can you say?
Well, he can, obviously, you think about this. Vince probably has no idea, outside of maybe seeing a match or something when he's trying to scout some talent, but he has no idea who a Jake Roberts or a Buzz Sawyer is beyond their wrestling personality on a TV screen at this point, I would imagine. And so for him to know where these guys are going to be, on what day, and that they are the guys who are most likely to be carrying things in their bags, that doesn't seem like any information Vince McMahon would have himself. So it easily seems like it would come back to Jim Barnett once you do the basic math in your head.
Barnett would keep, I'm sure he had allies or people who he was sympathetic to, or, maybe people that were getting payoffs from him that when Ole took over, those payoffs stopped. The guys who brought Barnett money, I'm sure he gave them something.
Yeah.
And, something, not $100, whatever. Well, that all stopped when Ole wasn't taking money like that. He wasn't letting anybody get hold of the money. It was smart that way. So the guys that had been getting the money from Barnett would at least have some appreciation of the fact that their economic life had been better under Barnett than it was under Ole. So if they could get Barnett back, they would be in better shape. So I can see why they would conspire to work against Ole, because Ole was take no prisoners. It was like, we talked about that at length about him just saying, somebody that really was a piece of shit would come out and just say, well, no, I'm great. I'm not a piece of shit. I'm great. Well, get in the ring and show me. And Trip getting in the ring, I almost fall down. Say, get out of here, you piece of shit. So that was Ole. Barnett would have said, "Oh, my boy, that was so unfortunate." He probably wouldn't use the guy, but he wouldn't be quite so uncomplimentary about the guy. But yeah, I can see why there'd be a lot of people from Barnett when he was running things. There'd be a lot of people that he left behind that would have been glad to see him come back.
This is Wrestling Nostalgia, the podcast that dives into wrestling history. Hey, wrestling fans, I'm Dave Dynasty, and if you enjoy podcasts that are knowledgeable and history-driven, then Wrestling Nostalgia is for you. With great guests and fun interviews, there are over 200 episodes in our archives. We chat with several first-time guests and often cover topics not discussed on other podcasts. Look up Wrestling Nostalgia on your favorite podcast platform and visit all of our links at linktree/WrestlePod. That is linktr.ee/RASSLEPOD. And remember, where we go, what do we do? Be good, be safe, and keep on growing.
Hey guys, Ray Russell here, curator of the WrestleCopia Podcast Network, inviting you guys to listen to many of the programs here as part of the WrestleCopia brand, including, but not limited to, the Wrestling Memory Grenade, currently covering the 1988 and the WWF project. You can also listen to the Regional Wrestling Podcast, where we talk the territories. You can also listen to the Wrestling Stoop with the legend himself, Bob Roop. But that's not all. You can also check out the Pro Wrestling Academy with the professor of Pro Resu, Mr. Dan Ginnity. Dan and I go back in time and cover the history of Japanese professional wrestling in the English language. And you can listen to all of those shows and more, all part of the WrestleCopia Podcast Network, located over at WrestleCopia.com. That's WrestleCopia.com, and anywhere your podcast streaming needs are met. And while you're at it, why not subscribe to our social media guys for all the latest goings on here at the WrestleCopia Podcast Network. Plus, I'm constantly adding old school video clips and pictures from throughout wrestling history. You can follow us over on X, formerly Twitter, at Wrestling Grenade. That's at RASSLIN Grenade. Also, follow and like me, Facebook.com/Wrestling Grenade. And why not subscribe to YouTube.com/Wrestling Grenade. And of course, now would be a fantastic time to become a WrestleCopia patron over at Patreon.com/WrestleCopia. That address again, Patreon.com/WrestleCopia, where you get so many gifts, including all of my insanely detailed show notes for every episode of The Grenade Show, Regional Wrestling, and the Monday Warfare podcast. You'll also get early access to a lot of the podcasts here on the WrestleCopia brand, where you can listen days and sometimes as much as a week earlier than the rest of the listeners. But that's still not all, guys. You also get at least a dozen digital downloads for your viewing and reading pleasure each and every month, plus random bonus video drops, and of course, the Patreon exclusive Watch Along series covering many past WWF and WCW events. And if that's not all, videocasts, also now a part of Patreon. No subscription, cancel anytime. Give it a try for a month, guys. I think you'll like the content that I offer, and every penny of it goes right back here into paying the bills. So if you're looking to support that next up-and-coming podcast brand, please consider making it WrestleCopia. Help me pay some of the bills to keep the WrestleCopia Podcast Network and all of the great shows here up and running for the months and the years to come.
Hey everybody, Gene Jackson here, inviting you to check out the Retro Wrestling Review, where each week I'm joined by some great co-hosts who help me review classic episodes of USWA Championship Wrestling, and right now we are doing week-by-week reviews of 1993. But we don't just do reviews, sometimes we get a chance to interview some of the people who were there and lived it, plus do watch-alongs. It's a lot of fun, so check out new episodes that drop every Wednesday at WrestleCopia.com, and to find links to everything associated to the podcast, you can go to USWApodcast.com.
All right, now there was another story, you had alluded to. We touched on it a little bit on the last episode, if I remember correctly, but you were involved. It wasn't necessarily this story that Ole told about Jake, but you had a story involving Jake, and you were there to witness his firsthand eyewitness here, Bob Roop. Tell us about your time watching Jake basically get searched, I believe.
When we flew into, it was a deal where every other week we'd fly into Ohio, into Columbus, rent the cars there, and then we'd go out wherever we were working, Ohio, Michigan, West Virginia, we're coming out of the Columbus airport, and Jake, when we got off the plane, they were waiting for him. And so I waited for him. He was with me. I waited for him. And after, I don't know, 15, 20 minutes, he came walking out the front of the airport. I knew he had drugs on it. So, but he came walking out, and I said, well, what happened? He said, they searched me and everything. And I said, well, you didn't have anything on you? And what he did, he had a bag. He had his wrestling bag, but he had another bag. It had like a netting that the bag sat in. And he held it up, and he turned it around. And in that netting was on one side of it, there was a lump of about the size of a silver dollar that was a bag of cocaine. And they just hadn't seen it.
Wow.
So I don't know if they searched that bag, but they didn't look it was on the outside of the bag. It was right there in plain sight. Jake was just lucky, and he knew it too. He did all that cocaine. He had a cocaine party that night. He got rid of all the cocaine.
Yeah, I remember you telling that part last time. Yeah,
okay. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Jake was, one thing about Jake, and it's to this day, I mean, I see him occasionally, his rehab and is trying to get his life back and all that. Let's put it this way. He's interesting enough that people are still willing to cover his life, even when he sank all the way into about as low as you can go. He's still a fascinating character. And, and he was then very interesting. He was fun to be around, always upbeat, nice looking. I took him home with me one time when we were working in Michigan, and we stayed overnight at my house. And he charmed my mother. I mean, he made her feel like a young belle again, the way he flattered. I think he wasn't hitting on her, but he was just very complimentary.
Yeah.
And my mother was very attractive, and so she was so impressed. She talked about him for years, like, you brought a bunch of wrestlers around, but that Jake, that guy, he was really, really nice. Wow. And he was. So, like I say, you talk about a close call. You got an 8-ball of coke on you.
Well, again, we go back to the names that were getting searched as well. I don't think that was by accident. So definitely, I feel like somebody certainly up high that knew exactly what was going on and where you would be exactly what time of day and what date. That certainly sounds like someone that would be in that level of Jim Barnett, right? Like a promoter, someone who knows the schedule and things like that. And so Jim Barnett leaves the NWA reportedly. We know Vince leaves the NWA in 1983. We move into 1984. And things are going to start changing here because this is when Black Saturday around the corner, Vince McMahon going to take over TBS. But in order to get there, I did some digging, got some information online, took a little bit from the Dark Side of the Ring and also Ole's book, obviously. And I was going to go into some more notes here with you, Bob.
Sounds good.
All right, so we're going to go into, well, it's coming soon, the selling of at least a lot of the stock here in Georgia Championship Wrestling. But Ole says that Georgia was a subchapter S corporation when I took over. I studied all the articles of incorporation. The entire document was 20-some pages of legal gobbledygook. I was concerned about the wording of the buy-sell agreement. The buy-sell agreement stated if a stockholder wants to sell his stock in GCW, they must first offer it to another stockholder. If none of the other stockholders want to purchase that stock, then they can agree to allow that holder to sell it to someone outside, subject to the approval of the other stockholders. Well, Jim Barnett had been violating the article all along because he had been selling his stock to Jim Oates. However, everyone chose to overlook that. You can study all 20-plus pages of the articles and argue all the fine points and nuances. When you get to the bottom line, one little paragraph destroys the entire document. If you can get 51% of the stockholders to go along with you, you can do whatever the fuck you want. Well, that's a hell of a little clause there in the contract.
Yeah, and that adjective you used is appropriate too. It's like, what the fuck, Yeah. Well, it cost only $42,000 with a lawyer to find that out.
Yeah, it was a lot of money. He goes into that quite a bit here, and I didn't really take any notes in regards to everything he spent and all the nonsense that went on in the attorney's office because it could have been a chapter in itself in his book, just insane. All the nonsense. But at the end of the day, we know the story. And that's when we get to the old blood oath story, Bob. And it's a little silly, but they told it on Dark Side. Ole tells it in his book. It happened, right? Jerry Brisco's told the story. Basically, the Briscoes are at a bar. They're having some drinks. Ole comes in. He starts drinking alongside of him, and he's trying to make sure these guys are on his side. And so Ole decides, we're going to take a blood oath. And Jerry kind of quipped something. I don't remember exactly how he worded it, but he was like, my word was my word. Or a handshake's fine, but Ole pulls out some sort of a knife or something and gigs himself. I thought, when I first heard this story, I pictured him doing it blood brother kind of deal, on your hand, cutting right. But the way they tell it, Ole slices his head and then forces the Briscoes to slice their heads as well. And they, swap blood or something along those lines, vowing they had to promise Ole that if they were ever going to sell their stock in Georgia, they would come to Ole first.
Thinking back, I don't know, I'm sure as champion, Jack Brisco had to, get blood at least a few times when he was a heel. I know Jack really didn't like the blade at all. Well, you're talking about multiple thousands of dollars, hundreds of thousands of dollars. So, yeah, that was big stake. Yeah, and the thing is, that stock only has value as long as the company is viable, as long as the company's running and everything's fine. If the company, tanks, your stock's worth nothing. It's like any other business, I guess. If you sell toilet paper, all of a sudden toilet paper becomes extinct, well, your company's extinct too. So I can see where, Ole came back from that. He came back to the office from that meeting and told me about it. I didn't know it was from the forehead. I didn't look, he didn't show me any marks or anything. I thought maybe it was a finger or a thumb or whatever. But
sure. So Ole comes right to you and tells you, yeah, we took a blood oath. Like immediately, this is the conversation you're having with him about this meeting that he had with the Briscoes. Okay.
Yeah, as soon as he came back, yeah. Oh, yeah, all the meetings he had, the one with Vern and Fritz and Watts and all that, he'd come back and tell me about them, yeah.
Okay, so I got to ask you, Bob. He comes back and he tells you, yeah, I took a blood oath with the Briscoes. What is your first thought? Are you fucking serious? Like, what was going through your mind when he goes, yeah, I gigged or whatever. He cut himself. He took a blood oath with the Briscoes there, about, trying to get them to basically say that, yes, Ole, if we ever plan to sell, we will come to you first. What were your thoughts? Did you just kind of go along with it? Did it make never mind to you? Or were you like, what the fuck's wrong with Ole today?
No, I didn't think that. I thought, first of all, I respected the heck out of Ole. And I could see why he would want to do something like that, because what else are you going to do? Make them put up, say, $50,000 warranty guarantee or something that if they sell, they lose the money. So that was one thing he could do. And, one thing we have evolved into or seen is that Ole was not wise to the way of the world in terms of drugs and some of the crap that went on among the wrestlers.
Yeah, he admitted that he was a different cat. He was, he wasn't a pro wrestler minded type of guy. I mean, obviously he was a booker, he was a promoter, but and what the boys did, Ole wasn't necessarily one of the boys in regards to the everyday life of what the average pro wrestler was doing in this era.
No, not at all. He was his own man. And there was a lot of things that, he saw a lot of stuff, guys, getting wasted all the time, coming to work sometimes wasted. And, he had no respect for that because he grew up with a strong work ethic. Talked about his grandfather carrying shingles up to the roof when he was in his 60s, carrying a bale of shingles on his shoulder up a ladder, stuff like that. That he had a completely different value system than a lot of the guys did. And Ole never, even though he had a stage name, he never changed in terms of who he was personally. All the things that went into him, including his college, including being in the service, what that did. It was the same with me, but nowhere near to the same extent. Ole had more ability to be a leader, like to be a shark in terms of business. I never thought about doing anything to the level he did of taking over a promotion. I always tried to do a separate thing. I had to go opposition. He went and just took one that was already working.
Right.
He bought into it first, looked for his opportunity. I'm not saying he went into it with that in mind, but I know he would always be looking because Ole was about money. He wanted to make money, and he always gravitated towards where the money was. And the big money at TBS or with the wrestling company was running it.
Right.
Or that's why he got Barnett out of there. And where he was the one that they were bringing the money to.
You talk about
Go
money. Ole says, he talked about this over 82. Well, at the end of 82, they basically pushed Barnett out of it, literally threatened to hang him over. And that's even told in The Dark Side as well. Kind of allude to dropping Jim Barnett off of his apartment. Was it his apartment or whatever? But his the penthouse that overlooked, let's say, concrete, if we will.
Yes. Yeah.
And so Barnett, basically steps down, and we're waiting for something to happen there. But in the meantime, Ole says he takes over the finances, and over the course of several months, they're finally out of the red and into the black. They're making money, or at least they don't have any debts, which is very important to begin things. That's one step in the right direction. And eventually Ole talks about having some capital. They have $200,000 in the bank, and the Briscoes find out, and they want their shares. And Ole's trying to explain to them as a businessman, no, we leave this in the bank because this is for our upcoming expenses. We have to pay for advertising for the towns. We have to keep a little money in here in case anything goes wrong. We have to have it for the venues. We need this money for X, Y, and Z. And the Briscoes are just looking at it like it's their money, their percentage. They want their money out of it. And that's Jerry's reasoning was Ole was holding this money and we wanted that money is the way Jerry looked at it. And Ole's looking at it like this technically is our money, but it's actually the company's money, not our money to spend. It's not like a payout, basically. Is what Ole was trying to explain, and the Briscoes simply wanted their fair share, I suppose, is how it was from their end, and that kind of helps persuade them, I'm sure, into siding with Jim Barnett, selling to Vince McMahon. Of course, that blood oath did very little. I mean, you're asking professional wrestlers to blade. I mean, that's not like the end of the world or anything. I mean, I'm sure they were like, what the fuck? But at the same time, I mean, it's not some big new thing to them. And so they go and do this blood oath thing in front of Ole, and obviously it amounts to nothing because they do wind up selling. And that's the next part of the story here. As Ole tells it, in March of 1984, my mother died. I called Jerry Brisco and I said, my mother has died, so I'm going to be in Minnesota for a week. I'll call every day and you can let me know what's going on. Here's the number where you can reach me. While I was gone, several of the board members held a quick late-at-night meeting. McMahon reached an agreement with the shareholders of Georgia Championship Wrestling. His ace in the hole was Jim Barnett. I had gone back to Minnesota because my mother died. 2 days after I left for Minnesota, I got a call from Louise Bennett, who was our secretary. Louise was crying, saying, Ole, they took our company. What are you talking about, Louise? Who took our company? Vince McMahon. So he says, we went to court. And there was lots of pages about the court. We were talking about how much he spent. And, I think Ralph Freed threw in some money as well. But, Ole lost a lot of his own personal money fighting this in court. But at the end of the day, Black Friday happens. And, he gets everybody out of debt. Everything looks like, positive moving forward. I know there were some issues. People started saying the booking got lazy. Maybe he wasn't paying for all the biggest talent coming in at that point in time either. When you watch 1983, you can kind of see where it's kind of in a lull, but I think that's a lot of Ole trying to get back out of the red is what that is. People don't look at it from the business side. They look at it as a fan's point of view. And so, but this is Ole's version of it. And unfortunately, after all the courts, all the attorney fees, all the nonsense involved, it happens. The sale goes through. Vince McMahon takes over Georgia Championship Wrestling, or at least the time slot on TBS.
Right. Well, if you think about it, some of the things Ole did, what came to mind was him firing Paul Orndorff that day at the Omni and just walking him out the door.
Right.
I'm sure the other stockholders, because Paul was a major draw for the company. He was a good draw. That was the only reason that he thought he could get away with missing towns in Georgia was because he was a big number. He thought that he was locked in because, well, with Ole, that didn't matter. But with everybody else, with the other shareholders, they said, you did what? You fired Paul Orndorff? You have anybody? Well, think about it. You have anybody to replace him? I don't know. I don't remember if business fell off or not. It always seemed to be doing at least fairly well. It wasn't capacity. It wasn't a deal. However, it was all sold out, but it was always decent. I don't remember ever going to a place that was even less than at least half full. Usually it was at 3/4 or so. And also the way that Ole ran things, he was the boss. He was going to want to be the one to make the decisions. And that might have rankled with guys because the other stockholders were going to have to get, like you say, get 51% in order to tell Ole what to do. And they weren't going to be able to get it. So I'm sure that rankled with them too. Going back to the $200,000 in the where there $200,000 in the bank, I'm curious if Barnett was paying dividends even when they weren't making a lot of money. Because one of the reasons that they went into such debt was because he was paying dividends to the stockholders to keep them happy.
Right.
If they were making, well, think about it. I don't know, but think about it. If they were making money, then if Barnett was making money too, in case it came out that he was getting all this extra money brought back to him, then he would have something to say. Well, yeah, I've just taken my share. I gave you your share too. And that's where they went however many hundreds of thousands of dollars they went into debt. Maybe that's where it came from.
We talked about this an episode or two ago where Ole alleged that every time one of the stockholders got a little upset, they weren't making any money, all of a sudden Barnett would give them some dividends. And I'll use quotation marks around dividends there. And then they were fine again. And I see where you're coming from, because if Barnett gets outed at some point in regards to this money disappearing or maybe taking a little off the top, these stockholders can always say, well, he's always treated me fairly. I always got my dividends, right? So that's the way they're looking at it. Like, he's not cheating me. So I don't know what he's doing with the rest of the money, but I'm getting mine. So it's very wise. Jim Barnett is one of the craftiest, smartest guys, not just in wrestling, but in business. You know what I mean?
Yes.
So absolutely. I can see why he was on top for so long,
Well, not really, because the black widow spider always kills and eats its mate after it mates. It kills the male.
Sure.
And eats it. So yeah, kind of, you talk about treacherous. Talk about expensive sex.
That analogy gets more and more just like Jim Barnett, the comparison. I can see it, man. But unfortunately, there's nothing Ole can do at this point. He's tried everything he could. He spent money on attorneys. I mean, lots of money, guys. I mean, do the math, do the inflation there. My goodness. And it didn't work. And Vince McMahon's going to take over the time slot. And eventually Vince is going to wander into TBS studios. And Ole says the first time he showed up at our TV taping with Gorilla Monsoon, a.k.a. Gino Marella. Gino was doing his best to smooth things out. I told Monsoon, listen, Gino, I don't hold any hard feelings against you, but I don't want that asshole anywhere near me. Let me tell you, if anybody looked like they were ready to take on the world that day, it must have been me, says Ole. Gino had an excellent background as an amateur wrestler, but as mad as I was ready to take him on and anyone else. Danny Hodge even might have had a hard time with me that day. I was ready to fight anybody and everybody. Tell me about that day with Gorilla Monsoon and Vince. This is the first time Vince comes up there. This is pre-Linda.
Yeah, I think it was a TV station. I seem to recall it was at the TV station.
He says it was at the TV station, yes.
Yeah, it was Monsoon and Vince, and then Ole asked me to come along. I don't think he was worried, but I don't know, maybe they have a witness or whatever.
That's what I was thinking, a witness, someone who can repeat what happened here if we need it. Yeah, I get it.
Yeah, and I was there for the whole thing. Vince offered to shake hands. Ole said, well, why should I shake your hand? You're trying to steal my territory. Fuck you. Pardon my language, but
it's in the book.
Yeah, and I couldn't blame him. I always admired, while that might not have been the smartest way to do it, I always admired the fact that Ole didn't change his personality. He didn't change in midstream. He was Ole from the start to the finish. And then Ole McMahon tried to introduce his wife, and Ole said something like "fuck your wife" or something like that.
Yeah.
And that killed it.
Yeah, that was the deal breaker, I guess. Yeah.
Oh well, McMahon. Boy, imagine if you're there with your. Oh, my understanding is that, in fact, I'm not an understanding. I know it for a fact that his wife got several government appointments in the Trump government.
Yeah, sure.
She was a big part of the business side of it, so she wasn't there just as like a arm candy.
She was there. Yeah, she was the head of Titan. Yeah.
Yes, she was there as in a business mode, and and with that in mind, I'm not saying I disagree with what Ole did, because I love the guy and I respected the hell out of it. I still do. But it might have been better to have some diplomacy there, only from the standpoint of, instead of breaking everything down before you ever have a chance to see if there's any room to maneuver or some way to attack, instead of just saying and slapping the person in the face and saying, screw you, and starting, making sure there's going to be a war. It's maybe not the best way to go, but who am I to talk? Ole was a multi-millionaire, very, very sharp businessman.
Well, even he has said, later in the book that was clearly a mistake at the time. But he's going to run into Vince several times here. The first was with Gorilla Monsoon, and Gorilla's trying to smooth things over. Gino Morella, who was actually a business partner of Vince Sr., and when Vince Jr. took over, he bought Gorilla's stock and everyone else's stocks that had any form of ownership in the WWF. And so Vince is the owner, and Gorilla has a job for life here next to Vince McMahon.
Right.
And so Gorilla comes in and says, "Hey, Ole, let's look. We're both, we've both been in the ring, And Ole admits, he had respect for Gorilla. He had no problems with Monsoon, but Gorilla was there to kind of smooth things over for Vince, and it didn't really work. And McMahon steps in and says, "Listen, Ole, it was just business, nothing personal. I will make you more money than you ever dreamed of making if you come and work for me." Ole's response on the first meeting, "Go fuck yourself," is a direct quote from his book. Gorilla just said, "Hey, come on, Ole." So Monsoon's still trying to calm him down. And Ole says, "I like Gino, but I didn't care what anyone thought." McMahon came down one or two more times. The first time was when Jack and Jerry Brisco were there doing depositions. Once again, Vince approached me. "Ole, it's just business. Come and work for me. Blah, blah, blah." I repeated my earlier comment. Go fuck yourself. The fact that Vince offered me a job was a smart thing for him to do. I can't say I wasn't tempted to take his offer, but I had such a low opinion of Vince McMahon. I was so mad about everything that happened leading up to the takeover. In retrospect, it probably wasn't the smart thing for me to do. Looking back on it now, he was probably sincere about what he was saying at the time. With all that had been said back and forth between us, it was an honorable gesture for him to make. I questioned it for many years after that, but I think he probably did mean it. I would have had to go along with Vince McMahon, and looking back on it all, I should have said, "Vince, make me all the money you can," instead of fighting it all by myself. But I believed in the business to such an extent that I thought it would be blasphemy to do the things that Vince was going to do. Some of the ideas that he had, I wasn't too happy about, but I could have lived with it had I took the job. So that's where we are at this point. Ole admitting that, maybe I should have just shut the fuck up and took the money and ran with it. Because at the end of the day, like you said, Ole was about making money, but this was his baby. He had worked tirelessly around the clock on this company, and it was basically yanked out from underneath him. So I get that part of it, where he's trying to keep it real on his side.
Yeah, he did. And it just popped into my head. Occasionally in Georgia, Ole would come to a town and he'd bring a couple of his kids with him. They'd be sitting in the car and they'd stay in the car. It would be parked inside somewhere where he could, they were safe. But I was thinking that was probably the only chance he had to be with his kids, because he was always working. So the only way he could see them actually was at work. When he was going to a town, they would ride in the car with him. So the only reason I tell that story is because he did sacrifice a lot. There was a 24-hour-a-day job doing what he was doing. He was running a major company. Imagine Ted Turner running TBS all by himself. Ole was running a major company basically on his own. He made the sacrifice, and I can see why. Once he had turned the corner financially, where they were profitable, I could see where he would not want. And also, after having worked so hard, so long to become the guy in charge, he had the scepter. He was the one running the show. I could see where it'd be hard for him to say, hand the scepter off to someone else and going back to being subordinate. Even if you're vice president, you're not the president anymore. And I want to say, in retrospect, you made a comment about his personal, one of the reasons that inability or his unwillingness to get along with McMahon was what he thought of him personally. The first time I've heard that, and I'm glad to hear it. No, I'm not glad to hear it, but I mean, it strikes a chord. Let's put it that way, because I felt the same way. I was never interested in working for McMahon ever. If he'd have called me and offered a job, I don't think I would have taken it, because again, it had to do with him personally. As a person, I looked at him. I didn't see anything I respected. And don't get me wrong, I'm not better or anything. It's just when you look at somebody, what I saw, body language, looks, attitude, the way they talk, whatever, I wasn't impressed. And I've met presidents, I've met all kinds of different people. I can see where Ole was coming from. And now, in retrospect, again, it took 30, 40 years. But what has happened with McMahon in terms of him personally, in terms of his character, he's shown to be a person of very low character with that behavior, just absolutely disgusting behavior. And that was what Ole saw. It's kind of what I saw, was that person who would be able to do that kind of crap, and be basically. And then, of course, I told you earlier, I told you and our friends out there that Trudy Luna had worked for the vets, and she told me a story about him getting her alone and forcing her to do a sexual thing with him because he was her boss. And once I heard that, of course, don't get me wrong, I didn't spend any time thinking about Vince McMahon because I just dismissed it. I don't think about negative stuff. But when Trudy told me that, I thought, well, yeah, I wasn't a bit surprised. Let's put it that way.
Sure.
So I never was interested, and I'm not trying to buck myself up like I'm somebody special. Vince McMahon still got more money in his pockets. I've gotten my whole repertoire, my whole financial deal, but that doesn't matter. Money's just something. It's a tool, really. Yeah, and I don't have any problem with Ole feeling that way. He didn't want to say, okay, I'll agree to do business with somebody that he looked at it from a personal standpoint. You got to remember also, Ole was an amateur wrestler. And, we have kind of a different attitude about things. Not that we're superior, we're just different. And he looked at Vince and he thought, I can't see myself just giving in to this guy. He's trying to steal my business, and he wants me to shake his hand and agree that it's okay with me. Well, it's not okay with me. Again, he said later, hindsight's always 20/20. He said later he thought about it, and it always turns out that way. If things happen, you say, well, oh, man, if I'd have just invested in that company when it was real low.
Sure.
But
we'd all be billionaires if we could do things like that. Exactly. Well, we talked about the first meeting. You were there by Ole's side when they run into Vince and Gorilla Monsoon. Again, Ole runs into Vince at a deposition with the Brisco brothers. And then comes the next deposition. Vince and Linda McMahon walk in this time. And Vince walks over to Ole this time and he says, Ole, I'd like you to meet my wife, Linda. By this time, we were really in the heat of a legal battle, says Ole. I had been raped so badly by those attorneys, I was so mad about everything. As I've always been a man of few words, I said, fuck you to Linda, then turned around and said, fuck you to Vince. That was when Vince said, you'll never, ever work again. Of course, Vince was more right than I was, because I never worked in what I'd call any big capacity ever again. So yeah, maybe a mistake. Ole's even went in later in the book that maybe I let the personal feelings get ahead of business here. And maybe, I don't think that he apologizes or says maybe he shouldn't have said that to Linda, but I think he acknowledges that was not the right thing to do in that point in time. But here's Linda walking in. She's done nothing other than back her husband at this point. And Ole just looks right at a female of all things. Ole didn't care what you were, white, black, brown, polka dots, whatever the case, or male, female, Jim Barnett, whatever the case may be. He's going to tell you what he thinks. And that's how he sees things. And wow, imagine that. You walk in and the first thing somebody says, you've never seen the guy before in your life. You're this dainty woman. Linda McMahon walks in there and the first thing out of this guy's mouth is, fuck you. I bet she had never heard that before. Well, maybe outside of Vince, never heard that before in her life.
Right. Well, what you're just saying about it makes me realize something about one of the reasons I liked Ole so much was because he wasn't your typical wrestler. He was Ole, and he was straight. He just told it like it was, and the hell with the consequences. And I mean, he wasn't rash in terms of trying to create a problem, but if there was a problem, he dealt with it in his way, all the way from being willing to fight two big 350, 400-pound guys by himself to deal with McMahon. And here's the deal. What Ole didn't understand, or I'm thinking about it now, if Ole was going to fight McMahon, he was going to have to do it with his own money. McMahon had, his company was producing a lot of bucks by then. He had a lot of money to work with. He could spend money. He was already doing it. He was buying TVs. He had the money to spend with. It wasn't coming out of his pocket personally. I mean, in a way it was, but he had a lot of revenue coming in from his show and from his TV, from selling his merchandising and all that he could use to fight Ole. And the bottom line is, money talks, everything else walks. Because I've seen, everything from very famous people get found innocent, and drop dead, open and shut cases are found innocent because they have enough money to influence a jury. 6 or 7 lawyers, the top guys, that find one little bitty evidence of the glove doesn't fit or something to get a guy who's obviously guilty of something, I'll get him found not guilty. Well, that works everywhere. If you've got the connections, if you've got the money, a lot of times you're going to win because you can throw money at something until the other person runs out of money.
Right. Yep.
And then you're going to win just by they're going to have to forfeit. So, he was going into a battle. Ole was going into a battle where he had no army at all. And Vince had an army that was getting bigger every day. Every night, every show he was running with all the merchandising. I'm not sure exactly about the time, but his company ended up, what did he sell it for? $23 billion, something like that.
It was quite a bit.
Yeah. So, nobody ever took a wrestling company to that level before. The guy was an exceptional businessman. His father was an excellent businessman and a good man, my understanding. I always liked him. I thought he was, however, when you see the way the kid turns out, you want to say, well, where did that come from?
Vince's upbringing was a little different for certain. He grew up in a trailer park with his mother and a abusive stepfather. The stories are out there in North Carolina, I believe. And at some point in his early teens, I think that's when he moves up north to live with his father, who was, obviously a businessman and very busy. I'm not saying that he didn't have time for Vince, but I believe Vince was always treated more of an adult by his father than just, your average kid, if you will. So Vince had an interesting upbringing, obviously, and he was always trying to prove, I'm not from the South. I'm not poor white trash. I'm not this. I'm not that. And, he's trying to outdo everyone. He always had that chip on his shoulder, it would seem. And I'm not trying to psychoanalyze him because I don't even know the whole story, but just the pieces that are out there are enough to kind of give you an idea of some of the things he may have went through early in life. And so, now he's out here, he's getting revenge on the world basically by taking over the wrestling business. And so at this point, there's depositions being made, and we're coming to the conclusion, the end of the court battle. It says, nope, Vince owns the majority of Georgia Championship Wrestling. He has taken over. And now we're going to talk about Ole realizing that he still owns stock in Vince's company here. Let's not forget that Vince bought the company or took over most of the majority. Now I heard it was just over about 52%, but according to Darkside and according to Jim Cornette, it was over 60% that Vince owned. But either way, all you need is that 51, right? And then you own the company. So no matter what it was, Vince had control of the company, but Ole still had his 10%. Let's not forget.
Right.
And so Ole says a few weeks after the court makes the decision that Ralph Freed, Fred Ward, Gene Anderson, and Ole, the final surviving members of the stockholders here in Georgia, the guys that were voting against Vince, they decided to try to get Vince to buy them out. Ole wanted $10,000 a point. That would be $100,000. He had 10 points, which is what I paid for my stock originally, says Anderson. I talked to Vince and told him that if he didn't buy us out, I would make his life absolutely miserable. I would attend every board meeting he called and cause as much disruption as I could. I paid $10,000 a point when I bought the stock in Georgia, so people ask me why I didn't hold Vince up for more money rather than settling for breaking even. The truth is, I was afraid I couldn't hold him up for any more money. All Vince had to do was terminate Georgia Championship Wrestling, and there wouldn't be any money coming in. If Georgia didn't exist, what would I get for my points? In addition, if Vince is running the TV and house shows and he doesn't book you, what are you going to make? Nothing. You have 10 points of nothing, Bob, and you're not being booked. You can't even make money as a wrestler because Vince doesn't like you, so he's not even booking you as talent. He could tell you, I'm taking over Georgia Championship Wrestling. I'll make the TV. You can go home. What are your points worth then, asks Ole. Nothing. So very good point here. He's basically saying they're going to pull a gunkle on me. I saw this happen before where we're just going to shut down the company and I'll go start another one over here. And then my points don't even exist anymore. So Ole wisely just going to take what he bought in with $100,000, give it back to me, and we'll just call it even. And all. He's already lost probably more than that at this point with attorney fees and all the other headaches.
Well, let's go back to something we started talking about at the beginning of this program. The Brisco brothers. Them selling their stock now looks like an act of genius, doesn't it? Because if the company goes out of business, or like you say, the Gunkel type situation, their points are worthless. They're worth nothing. They ended up getting, what, in today's money, millions of dollars, right? I think it was $300,000 at the time. And in today's money, that's about, what, $1.5 million?
It's well over $1 million, yeah.
Well, it was smart for them to sell. I mean, if I were them, with all that going on and the chance of, like you say, because there's no charter. There's no something it's not like the Baltimore Orioles or the Green Bay Packers. You know, it's a company that's basically on paper. I mean, the company's incorporated and all that, but you don't really have any assets to sell in terms of like a stadium or a team of players or whatever that you can sell. So, I don't blame looking back, I don't blame the Briscoes at all. In fact, it makes their move look pretty smart, really, to get the money while they could. And if Ole couldn't come up with it, which I don't know if they even tried to sell it. I'm sure they didn't try to sell it to Ole. But if Vince McMahon offered it, I can't say, looking back, I can't say. And I think if Vince had explained to the Briscoes, or maybe Barnett, representing McMahon, had explained to the Briscoes, well, this is what's going to happen. And it's very possible your stock could end up just going south where you won't get a nickel from it. So my advice to you is sell it. He's offering you $10,000, $20,000 a point, whatever it is. My advice to you is sell it. And I can't say I blame him for doing it because the stock is worth nothing if there's no company. That makes sense.
So by mid-July 1984, Vince McMahon is on TBS. So we have to assume sometime before that is when the court battle ended. And of course, Vince McMahon takes over the TV station. And so as I go into the next portion here, Ole basically saying that I'm going to sell my stock for what I bought it for. I want $100,000 from Vince McMahon, and Vince doesn't bat an eye at it. He could have shut it down. I'm surprised he didn't. Maybe there were some legalities there that Ole didn't know about where Vince couldn't do such a thing. But Vince offers him, okay, I'll give you $100,000. Will you take a personal check? Ole said he farted at that idea. He said, I don't want your check. I'll take a cashier's check or a bank money order. Vince looked surprised. Won't you take my personal check? No, I don't trust you. When the whole deal was completed, Vince shook hands with everybody there. Fred Ward, Ralph Freed, all of the attorneys. The attorneys were shaking hands because they made a few bucks out of this. Of course they did. Everybody was shaking hands with everybody. I didn't appreciate the gesture at the time, but I have to admit that Vince was a gentleman through the entire process. Well, you don't hear that every day. And coming straight shooting from Ole here, he says, Vince walked over one more time, held out his hand and said, Ole, it was just business. And for the final time, in front of all the attorneys and everyone else, I told Vince, go fuck yourself. And that was it. Oh, man.
Yeah.
So he says in closing, I think this is the end of the story here in regards to selling to Vince. He says, after everything was settled, I called Jerry Brisco and I said, Jerry, now that you've screwed everything up, we have a choice. We still have approximately $200,000 in the Georgia account. We can let Vince take control of it, or I can disperse it as a special dividend payment. Jerry held 10%, so he was looking at a dividend of $20,000 or so.
Right.
Jack would get a similar payment. I wiped out the entire account and wrote the dividend checks to the stockholders. Vince never said anything, so he must not have cared. I think Vince knew what he got here. He's like, $200, chump change, pal. Let him have
Exactly.
it. And so that was the end of that. That was the end of Georgia Championship Wrestling as we knew it, Bob.
Wow. Yeah, what a story. Interested to have been there for it. Yeah, it was different. I tell you, at the time, we're talking about multi-millions of dollars of business. McMahon's company was taking off, was getting ready to, and you could see it was going to, he was going to be successful. The fact that he was able to shut down just about everybody, eventually everybody in the country, it was easy to see that. I mean, let's put it this way: there was enough there to see that he was probably going to be successful, and that whatever he wanted to do, he was going to be able to do, because by that time he had become one of them, become a major player. And earlier, when the NWA was viable with all the different territories around the country, the WWWE or F, whatever it was, under Senior, Vince McMahon Senior, was just kind of an East Coast thing. They didn't go all over the country, at least not to my knowledge. Once Vince Jr. got national television, of course, he could go everywhere. And before that, he could afford to buy regional television stations, to buy his program, to pay to have his program put on the air, so he could promote all over the country. And he could come in, and if you're a promoter, I say your friend's out in Dallas, you got a big show 3 weeks from this coming Friday, all of a sudden there's another show in town on that Friday too. McMahon has booked a show opposite yours, and he's bringing on all his major players. Hulk Hogan is developed by that time. He's bringing in Hogan and all the guys that became big names for the WWF. He's going to come in and go opposition to you and do well. It might not kill your business, but it'll definitely hurt it.
Right.
And you begin to see, well, if they continue to do this, he's got the means through his televisions to make more and more, to keep getting stronger and stronger, where I'm basically in a holding pattern here. I've been here for 30 years or whatever, and my business is probably going to be about where it's always been, but except for now, this guy's coming in, he's taking, say, 20, 30, 40% of my business, where I'm barely turning a profit. They could see the beginning and the end. Although apparently when they got together, Fritz and Watts and Ole and Gagne, when they got together, they couldn't come to an agreement about that happening and figure out a way to work together.
So, and Jarrett would even get involved in that some too when they did the Pro Wrestling USA stuff and they tried to get something off the ground, but everybody wanted to control, book, promote, handle the money. They didn't want their local stars doing the jobs. And obviously that's not going to work out when everybody has, a different idea of who's supposed to be going over. So it didn't work out too well in any incarnation, but I want to go back here to the final court date when the decision is made and Vince basically gets to take over Georgia Championship Wrestling. When Ole comes back in defeat from this, do you have any recollection, any memories whatsoever of the first conversation you had with Ole after this happens in court and Ole loses Georgia to Vince McMahon? Do you have any memories of that? And do you have any memories of the first time Vince appears on TBS?
The first part, about his reaction. Ole was basically he came back and he did a rundown and a verbal analysis of his legal. He cussed the lawyers like a dog.
Yeah.
He said, this guy guaranteed me. He said it was open and shut. There was no way that they'd be able to sell. So I paid the guy $42,000. It turns out we go to court and the judge says, oh, no, that's not a problem. You can go ahead and sell it. Sure. And Ole was just only one thing when we've been talking about the whole time. Ole telling Linda McMahon F you and all that. Ole basically said what he felt. And one thing, whether you like it or not, what you got to realize, the guy was honest. He was legitimate. He was honest. He would express his feelings in the most basic way. And,
no filter.
No filter at all. And so, but that was it's one of the reasons I respected it, admired him in a way, because everybody else was double talking, swerving, trying to get some kind of advantage or confuse you or mislead you. Ole cussed out the lawyers, and then he said, well, here's what we're going to, he already put in a plan. I think he had already been talking to Ralph Reed or Fred Ward or both about getting another television. I'm not sure if they'd done it already, but I know that within a week or two, we went televised a station in Macon where we put out a show down there that we didn't make it at TBS anymore, but we played it down there and it played on TBS. I think it played on Sunday morning or somehow horrible.
I think it was Saturday mornings maybe. Ole gets into it here. Yeah.
Well, it's not too bad.
Yeah, he talks about getting in there with a little help from Ann Gunkel, who had still had ties with Ted Turner, and she gets you guys back on the station. A little help from Ann, but there's a reason behind that because, we'll get into that when we get to that part of the story. Ann Gunkel doesn't do anything for free. Let's just put it that way. But we're going to start from scratch. Ole loses Georgia Championship Wrestling. Ole loses TBS for the short term, and he certainly loses the 6:05 time slot in all of this, which really hurts. You guys lose the Omni. You lose everything, basically, and he has to start from scratch. And no more Georgia Championship Wrestling. It's going to be Championship Wrestling from Georgia. Put a lot of thought into that one, Ole. But just change the call letters a little bit there, but it's the meaning's still behind it. And what I want to do at this point is next week we're going to be taking the week off. My kids are on spring break, and I don't know that we're going to have the time to sit down quietly and do one of these deals. So what I'm going to do, Bob, actually, I wanted to go back and start from the beginning of your time here in the beginning of 1983. I think you come in around January of 83 and just go back and start telling the story forward again, but this time from a wrestling point of view, all the talent that came through, your memories and things you may have had from that time period of stepping in the ring or working behind the scenes, road stories, whatever may pop up. I wanted to go back and just talk about a lot of the talent because we would really be remiss if we didn't bring up all of the great stars that came through Georgia, all the guys that were about to hit the national expansion, pop up for Crockett and Vince McMahon a couple years from now. And so I want to go back and do that. And once we catch back up to this time period where Vince takes over, we'll begin to tell the story of Championship Wrestling from Georgia and your time there working for Ole under the new banner.
Okay. Sounds good.
All right. So as I'm scrolling through here, just some fun things coming when we get there. Of course, like I said, Ann Gunkel going to play a part in getting Ole that TV slot back on TBS eventually when you guys start back. You never really have any downtime. A lot of the talent leaves, though. Ole talks about some of the talent, seeing them one night and telling them, hey, if you guys are going to leave, just tell me now. I don't care. I just need to know so I can book accordingly. And we're going to get into those talents because they promised, Ole, we are not going to leave you. And a lot of those guys popped up for Vince McMahon the very next day, which is just really unfortunate. No honor among thieves in the pro wrestling world. So we're going to talk about that. That's definitely coming too. That's crazy. And you guys can kind of guess who they are because they popped up on TBS. They popped up working for Vince. So we can kind of guess some of those talents when we get there. But we're going to go back. We're going to talk about Wildfire, Tommy Rich, Jake the Snake Roberts, the Road Warriors, Tony Atlas, of course. We've got a fun Tony Atlas story coming. And so lots and lots of talent coming through here. Ted DiBiase, King Kong Bundy. My God, the list goes on. We're talking 2.5 years you spent, Bob, on the road and in the rings with a lot of these guys.
Right. Yeah. There were some good talent. You don't see it in terms of the everyday routine, getting up, getting ready to go and driving to a town. And then working, I mean, it's the same. It's the same. In my era, the road era, it was the same. You were always on the road. So, you weren't flying to a lot of places. Their talent came from being on television, of course. Mm-hmm. In terms of the person, as far as how they were personally, what kind of person they were or whatever, a lot of times that influenced the opinion I have to this day of what kind of, if they weren't someone who I respected or even liked. But I don't have any bad things to say about anybody, but I also don't have anything good to say about them either. But anybody, because you could put anybody on television, and if they can keep from falling down and making a fool out of themselves, they're probably going to become famous. Just the fact that you see them on TV. They even have a category now. It's not wrestling. It's all everywhere. What are you famous for? Paris Hilton. I'm famous for being famous.
That's it?
Oh, yeah, that's it. Well, did you do anything? Yeah. Have you done anything, really? No, but I'm famous.
But my father's rich, and so, yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah, I was born into it. I could go out every night, buy $200 bottles of champagne all night, and every night, and schmooze and all that. It was basically a vacuous, empty life as far as I'm concerned. You say don't knock it if you haven't tried it. Well, I tried it a little, and it sucks.
Well, that's to each their own. I would enjoy a day or two of that. I'm not going to lie to you, but again, maybe not around the clock for the rest of my life. But I kind of say, you could use a getaway like that in life. But, before we end this episode, I want to leave you with this anecdote. I guess you could call it that, from Ole in regards to his conversations with Vince going back to the mid-'80s.
Okay.
And Ole said after he lost his job with WCW in the mid-'90s, I think around 94, that would have had to have been, he called up J.J. Dillon, and J.J. had been working for the WWF going back to the beginning of 88. J.J. was there for about at least 8 years, so he was definitely there during this. J.J. was Vince's right-hand man in the office. And so Ole says, I called up J.J. one day in the 90s when Jim was working for Vince, and I said, J.J., I'm looking for a job. I can help you with the booking or with the wrestlers, whatever you need. Ole offering to be a booker, an agent, whatever. He wanted a job. He'd lost his job with WCW for some ridiculous reasons. But JJ replied to Ole that, I'll tell Vince and I'll get right back to you. I never heard from them again. I can't imagine why. So Ole he shot himself in the foot. He still came calling looking for a job, but Vince has a long memory. And he didn't meet Ole Anderson in the mid-1990s. So unfortunately, that's where the story ends with his interactions with Vince McMahon and Ole Anderson. So I thought that would be a fun way to leave the show this week, was just Ole kind of biting his tongue and not saying everything that he might have wanted to say here, but he knew he needed a job and he was willing to let bygones be bygones at this point. Enough time had passed. And he's like, all right, I get it now. It was just business. So let's do some business, huh? Well, remember when you told my wife to go fuck herself, pal? Maybe not.
Yeah.
So
can I add just a little anecdote or a story? I'm not bosom buddies with JJ, but I have known him. But we met that way back in Texas in 1969, 70.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I always liked him. I thought he was not a very big guy, but he's always a great worker. He'd go out there and convince people that he was tough, and a nice guy. I saw him at Cauliflower Alley. I believe it was Cauliflower Alley in Vegas. Years after he had worked for Vince, and also he wrote a book. It was in his book that he worked for Vince, and in his heyday, Vince had convinced him to buy a mansion out there somewhere in New Jersey, whatever, $500,000 or whatever. Connecticut, yeah. And to make a long story short, at the end of it, he ended up divorced and sleeping in his mother's garage. Yeah. Can you imagine going from being a top executive at WC or at WWE, and you end up, as a result of that, you end up ruined financially, emotionally, socially, and sleeping in your mother's garage. That's why I don't like Mr. McMahon.
The only good part of that story, the happy ending, is that JJ winds up getting a job not super long after that back in WCW working behind the scenes, and he's going to stay there for a while. So hopefully he made some of that money back. Yeah, that was hard times. Vince was cutting people, cutting the budget, cutting pay in half, especially to a lot of the which was really unfortunate for the office workers, like J.J. Dillon, who was in charge of so many things like talent relations. I mean, he had a lot of job titles, did J.J. Dillon, coming in there in 88. Vince, again, that was another masterful move because J.J. was Dusty's right-hand man in the booking office. J.J. knew what everybody was making, exactly when their contracts ended. And then Vince McMahon picks him up, hires JJ over to the competition. And now JJ Dillon has all this information in his head in a notebook. Well, Arn and Tully finish up on this date, Vince, and Barry Windham's going to finish up here, and he's only making X amount of dollars. So if you offer him this, and I have it on good authority, so-and-so's not happy. So it was a very masterful move by Vince McMahon, not just to bring JJ in because of everything he had in his brain, the knowledge that he had in the business of the NWA, but also JJ knew how to work the office. So he was a good man by all accounts. And so he made some good money there for a while, but like you said, in the end, he certainly got screwed. It was hard times for the WWF in the mid-90s. It was bad for business really all the way around for the most part, but things would pick up and JJ would get a job with WCW there. But that's going to wrap it up here this week, Bob. We're going to finish up with that. On that note, Ole Anderson loses Georgia Championship Wrestling. We've told the story. I've had a fun time doing it and getting your opinions and memories there, being alongside a lot of this going on. And Ole Anderson shooting himself in the foot, admittedly, on the business point of view. One too many fuck yous, I would have to say. And that's all it takes.
Well, as usual, Ray, you have arranged our output here today in another masterful way of getting television. I have a tendency to go off so far on the left field, you're completely not out of the stadium, you're out of the city. But I appreciate the fact that we did a program together, man.
Yeah,
this is the best.
I think we stayed within the city lines, so I think we did a good job this week. It was fun times, and I can't believe we've come to the end. At least this part of the story has come to a conclusion. Now we're going to go back to the beginning of you arriving in Georgia and just looking at all of the fun things going on, and maybe sometimes not so fun things, but hopefully some stories trigger other memories, and we know how that goes down the rabbit hole. So that's what we're going to be doing next time, guys. We're going to go back to 1983 and look at a lot of the talent and some fond memories of Georgia Championship Wrestling from that era. But for now, we're going to wrap things up. Bob, I want to thank you so much for doing it here this week.
Well, thank you, Ray. It's a pleasure to work with you. Thank you out there if you're listening to us. I really appreciate it. We're in this together, and it's a labor of love for me. Who wouldn't enjoy talking about their own life? But it's not just that. It's not just my life. It's the history we're talking about. We're preserving the history of my era through my eyes. And there's other people who've done it too. And that's good in a way, because this information now is there. I mean, it's like, what was it like 100 years from now? Hopefully, if there's any interest still, this stuff will still be there. It'll be relevant. So thank you, Ray, for your part in making this happen, my friend.